In today's notes, we're going to take a look at the events that led the colonies and Britain to the beginning of the American Revolution. First, a quick look back at where we left off at the end of our last unit. At the end of our last unit, we had begun talking about how the colonies and Britain were starting to grow further apart. A big reason for this is that we're several generations removed from the first colonists at this point. There are many people living in the colonies that have never lived in Britain. They were born in the colonies, they've lived their entire lives in the colonies, and as a result they don't feel any strong connection to Britain. We also talked about the French and Indian War, which is also known as the 7 Years' War. In that war, Britain sent troops to defend the colonies against the French and Native Americans. The two sides were fighting for control of North America. Ultimately, the British and the colonists win the war, and after the war, Britain keeps about 10,000 of their troops in the colonies, especially in the north in places like Boston. They said they were keeping these troops in the colonies to help defend the colonies from the French and especially from Native American attacks. To the colonists, it didn't quite seem that way. They believed that the British were keeping these troops in the colonies, again especially in places like Boston, to keep an eye on the colonists, to make sure that they were behaving, that they were following the rules. Keeping these troops in the colonies cost Britain a lot of money. They had to pay their salaries, they had to feed them and house them and provide them with uniforms and weapons and ammunition. All of that was extremely expensive. And since Britain said they were keeping these troops in the colonies to defend the colonies, they argued that the colonists should help foot some of the bill. To help pay for housing these troops in the colonies, Britain levied taxes against the colonies and colonists. This chart shows several taxes and other significant events that will lead us right up to the beginning of the Revolution. The first tax we'll take a look at was the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was a tax on imported goods, items imported into the colonies, especially items like sugar and molasses. And if you remember back to our last unit, we talked about the triangular trade. And in the triangular trade, goods like sugar and molasses were imported to New England. New England was the trade center of the colonies. The Sugar Act also included stronger laws against smuggling. Britain was aware that some of the colonists, some of the merchants in the colonies were avoiding paying taxes and were illegally smuggling goods into and out of the colonies. Those that were suspected of smuggling were tried by a single judge instead of a jury. That judge was most likely someone appointed by the king, or at least a governor that had been selected by the king. So that judge's allegiances would be towards Britain, towards the king. And colonists didn't believe that there was any chance they'd receive a fair trial if they were brought up on charges of smuggling. So on top of hurting the colonists' wallet, especially those in New England and places like Boston, they also feel that they are not being protected under the law of Britain. The next tax we'll look at is under the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is important for a couple reasons. First off, it's important to remember that not the Stamp Act or the Sugar Act were the first time the colonists had ever paid taxes. They paid taxes to their own colonial governments. The Stamp Act is important because it's the first tax from Britain that affected pretty much all of the colonists. It taxed paper documents. Anything on paper, anything printed on paper was taxed. Legal documents like wills, newspapers and books, even items like playing cards. In response to the Stamp Act, one of the first revolutionary or rebellious groups is formed in Massachusetts, in New England. They were called the Sons of Liberty and were formed by, among other people, Sam Adams. The Sons of Liberty argued that they wouldn't stand for taxation without representation. They believed that they were being taxed by a British government that they were not represented in. And ultimately, they were able to convince the British government to repeal the Stamp Act, or to eliminate the Stamp Act. Our next set of taxes were the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were another tax on imports, but this one's a little bit different. The tax on molasses and sugar in the Sugar Act really only affected the merchants. The Townshend Acts tax a very important import to the colonies. They tax tea. They taxed tea and basically put colonists in a position where they were forced to buy tea from British merchants. The tax on tea was 3 cents, which wasn't an astronomical amount in this time period, but it was significant. And it was most important because it was taxing the most popular drink, the most popular beverage throughout all of the colonies. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty called for a boycott, and in response to that boycott, Britain sent even more troops to Boston. And by the end of this next wave of troops that were sent to Boston, Britain had 1 troop for every 4 citizens living in Boston. For those that lived in Boston, it felt a little bit like a military takeover by Britain. This will lead to the first bloodshed leading up to the Revolution. It takes place in Boston. A lot of what happens, especially in the early years of the Revolution, takes place in Boston. It was kind of a hotbed for revolutionary ideas. The people that lived in Boston felt like they were more impacted by many of the taxes, many of the laws that Britain was passing down. The Boston Massacre started when a crowd of angry colonists gathered outside the Boston Customs House, the place where items were stored as they were being inventoried and taxed. And they taunted the British soldiers that were standing guard at the Customs House. We're not entirely certain how it started, but it's believed that rocks and snow and ice were thrown at the British troops. The British troops opened fire. They killed 5 colonists, injured others. The first colonist, who is believed to have died, was a man named Crispus Attucks, and he's considered the first casualty of the Revolution. The way the Boston Massacre is portrayed to the rest of Boston, to the rest of the colonies, is extremely important. Almost immediately, word goes out throughout the colonies that British troops attacked a crowd of unarmed colonists. It's trumped up by individuals like Paul Revere, who created a famous image that showed up in newspapers all over the colonies. And it's dubbed for the very first time the Bloody Massacre. Just those words and the images of armed British troops attacking unarmed colonists inflamed passions all over the colonies, and for the first time, all of the colonies start to feel outrage towards Britain. To try to ease some of the tensions after the Boston Massacre, the British eliminated almost every tax that they had imposed on the colonies up until this point. The one that they didn't eliminate was the tax on tea. It's argued why they didn't eliminate that one tax, and most likely it's because they still wanted to show that they had some control. They were going to keep that one tax, one that meant a lot to many of the colonists. In response to keeping that tax on tea, maybe one of the most famous events of the early years of the Revolution takes place: the Boston Tea Party in Boston Harbor. What upset a lot of the colonists was that the British East India Company, a merchant company, was allowed to sell their tea without charging a tax. So, if you wanted the cheapest tea, you had to buy it from the British East India Company. That cut out the colonial merchants from the tea trade. They couldn't survive. They couldn't compete with the British East India Company. In response to this tax, and in response to what was happening to Boston merchants and colonial merchants, a group of Boston natives disguised themselves as Native Americans. They carried axes, they wore feathers in their hair, they wore Native American clothing, they even took charcoal and smeared it on their faces and dressed themselves up in war paint. They went to Boston Harbor, they seized a number of British East India Company ships, and dumped about 15,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain passed the Intolerable Acts. It was clear to them that they were starting to lose control, especially in places like Boston. So many of the Intolerable Acts focused on Boston. First, Boston Harbor was shut down. Now the number one industry, the top two industries in Boston, are no longer able to exist: trade and shipmaking. It also included the Quartering Act, which allowed British soldiers to be housed in colonist homes and businesses and buildings. And they placed a military general, General Thomas Gage, as the governor of Massachusetts. The British military now ruled Massachusetts, and again, especially Boston. As all of these events are taking place, the colonists are beginning to become more organized, and they're starting to stockpile weapons. Thomas Gage and British troops get word of weapons being stored outside of Boston in two smaller communities, Lexington and Concord. General Gage sends his troops to Lexington and Concord to seize colonists' ammunitions, to seize the stockpiles of weapons and ammunition that they've been keeping, and also to look for a few of the bad eggs that have been causing a lot of trouble, individuals like Samuel Adams. For the very first time, armed colonists and armed British soldiers meet face to face. They meet on the common area in Lexington called Lexington Green, and it's pretty much a massacre in favor of the British. The British are able to scatter the colonists, who are poorly armed, have no training, and march on to Concord. It's on their way back that the colonists get a bit of revenge. They don't line up and fight in the standard way. They don't stand across the field and take turns taking shots with British soldiers. Instead, they hide behind stone walls, behind trees, behind hills, behind hay bales, and they attack British troops as they're on the road marching back to Boston. In a lot of ways, it was a huge victory for the colonists. They forced British troops to scatter. They killed and injured several. To the British, this was unthinkable. First of all, not fighting in the traditional way. That's not how wars are fought. Second of all, this is their colonists. Their colonists attacking British troops. In response, the Second Continental Congress names George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army, and we are now on the brink of war. This leads to what's considered the first actual battle of the Revolutionary War, because it includes two armies fighting against each other, not just colonists fighting against the British. It takes place just outside of Boston. It's known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it actually didn't happen on Bunker Hill. It happened next to Bunker Hill on Breed's Hill. The colonists controlled the top of the hill, and British troops were sent in waves up the hill. This is where George Washington famously told his troops to wait until they could see the whites of their eyes. He told them this for two reasons. They had very little ammunition, and if they wasted a bunch of shots, they would run out of ammunition before they could even think of defending the hill. Also, Washington knew that he had an army of untrained soldiers, and he really didn't trust their aim to start firing before the British troops were literally right in their face. From a casualty side, it was a big win for the colonists. 311 colonists are injured or killed to over 1,000 British, and it's the bloodiest battle of the American Revolution. The very first battle is the bloodiest. Ultimately, though, it is a victory for the British. They eventually take the hill, and the first battle of the Revolutionary War goes to the British.